So for those of you who may not know me, my name is IJ Onyechi Bercho. I'm serving as the chair of the Peabody Race Equality Network, and I'm also the director of New Homes and Customer Care at Peabody. I'll have the privilege of co-hosting this session alongside the fantastic Vuyo, who you can see on screen. Before we go into the discussions for today, which really is a conversation with Sandra, I'll pass what I like to call the virtual floor to Vuyo, who will briefly touch on the significance of Black History Month and also outline the session's format.
Thank you, IJ, and welcome to everyone. I've just seen there's someone put in the chat Nepal. So we've got Nepal and South Africa. So this webinar has gone international, which is fantastic. We love a message that has far-reaching impact. Afternoon, everyone. My name is Vuyo. I am the Diversity and Inclusion Manager here at Peabody. I want to spend a few minutes just sharing some thoughts and insights about Black History Month, just to lay the context, the foundation for the conversation we're going to be having with Sandra. So the first thing is, why is Black History Month important? The first thing that I think really is, it is about bringing awareness and knowledge about Black people's contributions to a wider audience. If we look at the theme for this year, it is saluting our sisters. And with that theme in mind, I want you to consider the story of Mary Seacole, who made numerous contributions to the world of nursing. She passed away in 1881, and for a few hundred years, her story was lost to us. Until in 2004, she was voted one of the greatest Black Britons. And her story kind of gained momentum and started to be shared a little bit more widely. So Black History Month is about, one, we don't forget the people and their contributions, but we really, one, honor them, and we benefit from their knowledge and the parts and the contributions that they have made to society. The second thing is Black History Month really offers us all an opportunity to learn. I, as a Black woman, my story does not reflect the story of every Black woman or every Black person for that matter. So Black History Month events like this are so important because they give us an opportunity to learn, to connect, to really start to build that sense of inclusion and belonging, particularly in the housing sector, because we want to make sure that we are delivering that sense of belonging in the communities that we serve and in the spaces where we work and live. Okay, great. That's fantastic. Where did this Black History Month actually start? Well, it was started in the US in 1926 by a gentleman called Carter G. Woodson. And it started as a Black History Week because he was eager. He was really promoting the teaching of Black history in public schools. In 1987, in the UK, Ghanaian-born Akiyaba Adaisebo, with the help of a community, coordinated the first Black History Month event in October of the same year. And I use that word community because it's so important when we talk about inclusion and becoming a more inclusive workplace or community or society. In the development of that concept, he was supported by Greater London Council, by politicians, community activists, London Strategy Policy Unit, and senior officers. And actually, when we talk about being inclusive and anything that we're doing to become more inclusive, for me, it is about that community. So what does that look like inside Peabody? It is about working with our chief executive. Chief Executive Ian McDermott is working with the executive sponsors for all of our employee-led networks. It is about working with our colleagues, our chairs, our allies. And it is also not just an internal connection, it is also about connecting with you that have joined, our colleagues in the G15 and the housing sector, and Unify, just to mention a few off the top of my head. Why do we do this? Because we want to make sure that we are not just inclusive, we're also delivering inclusive services. So sit back, enjoy, engage, ask questions. And my encouragement to you is take something away where you will ask questions, you will start to learn a little bit more about the communities where you are, where you're serving. And just let's really start to move the needle on inclusion. Thank you, IJ. I'll hand back to you.
Thank you so much, Vuyo. Anyone that knows will know that we're always quite happy to collaborate at Peabody and to shout out the great work that we're doing around equality, diversity, and inclusion. So going back to why we, came up with this session, as most of you are aware, the theme of the Black History Month this month is celebration of our sisters. And who could be a more fitting subject for celebration and inspiration than Sandra Skeete, the CEO of Octavia Housing, and I'm proud to say a former executive director of housing at Peabody. I have a really vivid recollection of my early days in the lettings department back in 2007 at Peabody when I joined as, I tell everybody, a team administrator. At that time, Sandra was one of only 2 Black women in a leadership position at Peabody. I remember thinking at that time and wondering at how many obstacles she would have had to overcome to reach that point. So with that in mind, it brings me immense joy to extend a warm welcome and introduce our distinguished sister and speaker, Sandra Skeete. So over to you, Sandra.
Thanks very much, IJ. And it's a privilege to be here. It really is great to be back. And Vuyo as well, thank you for the introduction. Black History Month. I know Peabody's been celebrating it for many years. It's good to hear a bit more about the history, and it struck me there that my career in this sector started just 1 year before the first Black History Month celebration in the UK. So a few decades of experience to try to share with you in a short period, but I'm hoping that through the Q&A we'll be able to draw out some of the issues that are most important to you. And really just to emphasize the point that IJ's made, there are lots of stories. The stories need to be told, but, each individual story has value. I don't have a blueprint, but I have some thoughts and experience that I'd like to share. And hopefully there are things that you can reflect on and take away and think about what you might want to do differently or what might change as a result of this celebration. Because for me, Black History Month is about showcasing, but it's also about what we then do with what we've learned and what we've heard. So as IJ has said, I'm going to share with you a bit about my journey to date, some of the challenges and also just my thoughts on the sector, but some of that will come out more through the Q&A than through the initial presentation. But so yeah, over 35 years in housing. Someone described me this week actually as a housing lifer. And I hadn't really thought of myself in that way before. And I could just talk about housing, but I thought I would kick off by just saying a little bit about me, because, the CV's out there and I'll talk about some of the roles that I've done. But I know people often say they don't know about, who is Sandra Skeete other than the housing lifer. So just so you have a bit of background, I am the child of parents, the Windrush generation, who came to the UK in the 60s from the Caribbean. They brought with them an incredibly strong work ethic and also emphasised the importance of gaining a good education. They came to this country not to stay, but to see, to do their bit and to return. But, we are still here, and having made that decision to stay, they wanted to ensure that they instilled, those really strong values in all of their children. I've got 3 siblings, and to make sure that we fulfilled our potential. And I think that's something that I've carried with me throughout life. So growing up in the East End of London, attended my local comprehensive school. Got some interesting alumni from my school. I'll give you a few names just to give you a sense of some of the great women who have been through the schools I attended, and I attended all girls schools. So June Sarpong, journalist and broadcaster, attended one of the schools I also attended, slightly different time, but not that far behind me. Sharon Wipes, the chairman of John Lewis Partnership. Sunita Elaine, the first female master of an Oxbridge college. Just 3 of the alumni that have attended the local schools that I attended. And so, they are real trailblazers. They, I think, have broken the mold. They've set their own path for success. And they all started from fairly humble beginnings and have really shown what is possible. And, I think they are an inspiration. If I can compare myself to them, I look at like a bit of an underachiever. But, in terms of me setting my own goals and, my own ambitions, I'm pleased with what I have been able to contribute so far. I'm a mother of two. I've got two children in their 20s, a son and a daughter. They are on their own path now. It's really good to see that, you know, after the challenges of being a working mother, constantly beating myself up over the years, you know, those guilt trips that we often have. Are we doing enough? You know, are we giving enough as a mother? Are we committing to doing enough to pursue our careers or progress our careers? It's good to know that they are both on a path that they are really happy with. And for me, that is that's an element of success and something that I take with me way beyond the life of my career. I think the other thing to say is that class, so I've grown up in a working class background, race, gender, and age have always played a huge part in my career and life journey. Age less so now, but they were for many years within my career. And if you bear in mind that I was a head of service within 10 years of starting my career, and I was running an association within about 12 years of starting. So age has always been a factor where there has clearly been questioning about, you know, how I got my role, why I'm in that position, and whether I have sufficient life experience or work experience for that matter to be able to hold the positions that I've held. But you know, for me, I've never allowed any of those things to hold me back. I feel very much that those things that I believe, you know, very strongly that those things that make us different always also kind of bring strength and to us, and we should try to really stay true to who we are. You know, I learned very early on that it's hard work trying to be someone else. And so the things that people may question are the things that I hold dear, and they shape who I am as a person. So that's a little bit about my background. As in terms of my career, as RJ has said, I'm currently CEO of Octavia Housing, one of the oldest housing associations in the country. I've been doing that role since 2019. In addition to that, I'm an associate non-executive director on a building society board, a Principality Building Society based in Cardiff. I'm also a trustee for Leadership 2025, which is a charity, an organisation set up to try to dismantle and challenge structural racism within the housing sector, and doing that by trying to increase the leadership or improve the diversity of leadership within the housing sector. And I'm also a board member of Place Shapers. Place Shapers is an organisation which really focuses on supporting place-based local housing associations to have impact within their local communities. So those are the things that I do alongside the role at Octavia. Just, you know, in terms of my journey, you know, people often look at where I am and have, you know, made assumptions or think that I've had either a meteoric rise, and I haven't. I mean, I read recently an article shortly after I was appointed at Octavia, and I was referred to as the new guard, which did make me chuckle because I've been doing this for many decades. But I think the message there was more around that, you know, there is a new group of CEOs who are now emerging within the sector. And so although it made me chuckle, I think it is an important message that we are now in the sector seeing more people, more diversity at leadership level. But it hasn't been a straight line trajectory for me. Yes, I started my career and I benefited very early on from positive action. So I was a PATH trainee, positive action for training in housing. The PATH scheme grew out of concern in the 80s following the riots, and one of the concerns was around housing, and there was recognition that we needed to increase representation of Black and Asian people within the housing sector, and the PATH scheme grew out of that, and I was on the very first London scheme. So I have benefited from positive action. I was fortunate to be placed at what was community housing. It was then One Housing, and One Housing is now part of the Riverside Group. And it was great to start my career in an organisation that really allowed me to grasp every opportunity that was there. And, you know, I was often just I was there for 4 years, but throughout that 4 years, I changed role and I made a point of making sure that any new role, opportunity, project that was being established, that I asked whether it would be okay for me to put myself forward for it. And more often than not, they said yes. And that was great. And I stayed there for 4 years, as I said, but even the actual trainee scheme was for a year, but I managed to get a job at Community within months of joining the trainee programme, and that's why I stayed there for longer than the programme itself. But I think the thing that I learned through my experience in that early stage of my career was the importance of trying to just grab opportunities, even if it meant that my pay didn't necessarily increase. It was more about preparing me for that next step. And it's that approach served me well. As I said, this isn't a blueprint, but it served me well. Often I found myself putting myself forward for things that no one else wanted to do. But again, it was just great experience. So at an early stage of my career, I was sitting on committees for our supported housing projects and, getting experience about how organisations would run that I would never get if I just stayed in my lane and just did what was required of my job. And it meant that I was interacting with lots of other organisations as well. So I had the benefit of learning how others approach things and being exposed to networks that I otherwise would not have been exposed to. So I think that early grounding really did help, and the trainee programme that was combined with formal training, formal learning opportunities, as well as that work-based learning, so you could apply what you learned in there. So that made a huge difference, and it was a really great foundation for me at the start of my career. But in terms of, did I have that rapid rise early on? Yes, I think it's fair to say that I did. So I was in my first CEO role running a housing association within 10 years of joining the sector. And as I probably mentioned earlier on, I was head of service. It's actually within 6 years of joining or starting my career. And in that time, I managed to have 2 children. So I had my 2 children by the 9th anniversary of me starting working in housing. I had them 13 months apart. I could suggest that I planned things really well and it all fell together, or you could say I'm absolutely crazy and why would you? But, it worked for me. But as I said, it did bring some challenges around, how do you navigate being a working mother of, very young children in a really senior role and make sure that you are actually doing all of those things to the best of your ability. It meant that my kids probably did not have they didn't have some of the things that some of their friends might have had. So, for example, I made some compromises. I made some decisions that there were things that I was not prepared to compromise on as a mother and as a working mother. And so, for example, I would never miss a sports day. I would never miss a parents' evening. If my kids had committed to play dates that I needed to be there, I would never cancel those things. And it was just finding ways of doing that at a time where you could not say, I'm not coming to that meeting because I have to be at sports day. So it was actually, it would have been frowned upon, but things have really changed now, and I'm pleased to hear that. But it meant that I did not have time to actually develop my skills around sewing and making fancy dress outfits. So my children never had the best fancy dress outfits. I'm hopeless at baking cakes. They were never able to take in any homemade cakes to school. But the things that I thought were important, I focused on those. So a lot of compromises along the way. I've only talked about the first few years, and I'm conscious of time, so I'm gonna rapidly walk through the next few years. So, I think having worked in housing throughout, I've worked across a range of different organisations. I've worked in housing associations primarily, but I've also worked within arm's length management organisations with a close relationship with local authorities. And I'm really glad that I've had that breadth of experience, because every role that I've had, I've been able to take something into the next role. And, I've had some fantastic roles along the way, and I'll maybe talk about highlights rather than cantering through every role. But the first big highlight for me is my role at Refugee Housing Association. And that was where I was asked to, I was appointed on a fixed term contract of 2 years by what's now an organisation which is now Metropolitan Thames Valley, but it was Metropolitan Housing Partnership, Housing Trust at the time, because they had taken on what they saw as a failing organisation that the regulator had concerns about, and they really had 2 years to prove that it had a viable future. And for me, having been appointed for 2 years to help with the turnaround and then leaving after 9 years, I think during that time we showed that actually that organisation was more than viable. It was able to grow. We really focused on supporting the most vulnerable in society. And for me, that's what's important. That's why I do this role. And running a refugee organisation where you're supporting unaccompanied minors, where you're supporting victims of torture, where you're helping people at the most vulnerable and challenging times of their life. For me, that was incredibly rewarding, and doing that with an incredible staff group who were totally committed to what we were all trying to achieve was an amazing opportunity. And I left that organisation after 9 years. I could have stayed for longer, but I think it's important to know when to move on. Moving on in terms of your own personal development, but also organisations need to refresh. They need to really make sure that they are continuing to go in the right direction. Sometimes it needs new blood and energy to do that. And I think it's an important lesson about knowing when it is time to move on. And I, as I said, not a straight line trajectory. When I left that organisation, many people were expecting me to go on to a bigger CEO role in a bigger housing association, but I took the decision to make a sideways move. And I moved to an Elmo. I moved to, it was Westminster's Elmo, City West Homes, one of the biggest in the country at the time, 3-star excellent. And the reason that I decided to make a sideways move was that I felt that there were gaps in my CV. I felt there was a risk that an employer looking in on what I had done to date would see someone who, yes, has run an organisation, but it's relatively small, it's quite specialist, and I perhaps don't have that breadth of understanding and experience that I would need to get to where I wanted to be. So I didn't lose focus on where I wanted to be, but I think that I felt there was another path to get there. So I think it is important to be prepared to make those moves that are sideways. Sometimes you might have to step back in order to leap forward. And I've done that on a few occasions within the career. But it's doing that with a purpose, but also taking some calculated risks, because the role at refugee housing, I suspect many people would say, well, and they did say, why would you take this role? The organisation has a failed business plan. The client group is no longer going to be eligible to public funding. The organisations who are providing accommodation that you manage want their accommodation back. Why would you take it? Now, maybe in my moment of madness, I thought I could fix the world. I was a lot younger then, but my view was that, this is an opportunity to really show the art of the possible. And as long as we had a clear direction, a clear purpose, the support from our parent organisation, a good team, then chances are we could do something. And we as a team were able to do that and to show that we could do that. But that was a calculated risk. But what I've also gone on to, what I often say to people is, as well as taking calculated risks, try to avoid the glass cliff. Because there is that research and evidence out there that the kind of roles that we tend to get as Black women or, Black leaders are those roles that are really difficult to succeed in, that others may not choose to take or be offered. So we tend to get the opportunity when things are too difficult. That's not to say that you shouldn't take them. Again, this is not a blueprint, but it's about thinking through how you will navigate and survive that situation if you find that actually it hasn't quite gone as you would have liked, and having that strong network around you to help you to navigate that. Other highlights, I couldn't come to a Peabody session without talking about Peabody. Again, 9 years seems to be a magic number for me. I spent 9 years at Peabody, worked for a lot of really inspirational people on the executive team, in the wider organisation. What I would say about my career is that I've worked for relatively few organisations, but I have tended to my role has always grown in the organisations that I've been in. And so at Peabody, I started off managing the housing operations, and over time that role grew so that I was responsible for property as well. What I'm particularly proud about there is to see how many of those fantastic people that I worked with have really progressed and are really doing great things, including IJ. So it's really great to be invited today. I have absolutely been so pleased to see how your career has progressed since we met all those many, many years ago when you were in the lettings team. And I think it's a credit to you, and it's also a credit to Peabody as well. So good to see that. But overall highlight for me at Peabody was about being able to improve the housing service. So we were as well known for what we were doing in housing and in our neighbourhoods as we were for what we were building, and that wasn't always the case. And so I'm particularly proud about that. And then more recently, to be leading one of the oldest housing associations in the country, again, something I'm incredibly proud of. Having said that, it has probably been the most challenging role within my career, and partly because it's really a really difficult time to be leading housing organisations at the moment with the environment that we are working within. But it won't detract from all of the other things that I'm particularly proud of over the years. Conscious of time, so I will kind of wrap up, and maybe we can just move to questions and draw out some more lessons along the way. So just in terms of closing remarks then, a few highlights there. But for me, what I would also add is really the importance of the teams that I've worked with along the way. And I think you'll see that, for me, reflecting and looking back, the areas where I felt we achieved most and achieved lots were in those organisations where we had fantastic teams pulling together. And I haven't mentioned my first head of service role, which was in an organisation that was a startup. I was particularly pleased there to be able to provide accommodation to thousands of people who would otherwise have been in bed and breakfast accommodation as temporary accommodation. But it was a startup, it was a new organisation. We started with a blank sheet of paper, but actually brought some brilliant people into that organisation who made sure that we did the best by the people that we were serving. And ultimately, for me, that's what it's all about. So I'm gonna end there, IJ, and give you an opportunity to maybe tease out a bit more through your questions.
Thank you, Sandra. And really, thank you so much for. I've been sitting here trying not to look away from the screen because I've been scribbling some golden nuggets as you've been talking. And really fascinating to hear your journey over 35 years in housing. So my first question is a little bit of let's jump into the deep end. But again, pulling on that 35 years of experience, I'm really fascinated to hear what you think about diversity in the sector, particularly in terms of embracing, promoting and advancing diversity of Black women leadership.
Right. How long do we have? Okay. I mean, it's a huge question to start with, really. And as I said, I started in the sector through a positive action course, which recognised that representation was an issue. It's fair to say that the challenges that we had in the 80s in terms of lack of representation are probably we've moved on beyond those. We don't have the same lack of representation overall in the sector. I think there are probably some parts, pockets where it's an issue, but overall, I would say that representation in itself isn't an issue. The issue for me is more around leadership. And, if I reflect on where I was when I came into the sector all those years ago and what I thought it would be like in 20, 30 years' time, my hope would have been that it would be more diverse than it currently is. And so there is clearly work to be done. But having said that, I think it's also important to recognise that things have moved on to an extent, but it's what is it that has enabled things to move on? And, do we need to see more of that in the future to actually increase the pace of change and increase the diversity at leadership level within the organisation? But I've already mentioned path. one of the things that I feel has made a big difference is actually the BME housing movement itself. And, you know, that initiative that was there to kind of fund and support the establishment of the BME housing sector, which was very much, you know, really supported and led by people within our regulator at the time, you know, working with leaders from BME communities to encourage the transfer of assets to Black-led enterprises and the transfer of wealth. I mean, I feel that that's a huge, you know, and a really significant example of the things that can have a big impact, and, you know, something that we might need to see more of. But the interesting thing there is, I'd said that PATH was a result of the riots, and you know, the BME sector, that perhaps would not have grown to the extent that it did if it wasn't for the intervention of the regulator. So there was that external stimulus there as well. My thoughts are on this that we probably do need some kind of external stimulus again in order to make the kind of leap and changes that, so that we're not waiting another 40 years to see many more people like me. I also think we need to recognise that the housing sector, there are so many organisations where, you know, the sector was grown out of, or born out of, a concern for what was happening within BME communities. And so some examples of that are Notting Hill Housing Trust and Metropolitan, you know, Thames Valley, where, you know, I know this from my own time there, that it was the concern about the housing conditions of the Windrush generation, primarily from Jamaica, and I think it was the Jamaican High Commissioner's wife, Dame Molly Huggins, I hope I've got that right, who was concerned and established what has now grown into Metropolitan Thames Valley. So the sector has done some really good things over the years, which we have to acknowledge. But I think we need to think about, how do we build on those examples, or what do we learn from those examples that will enable us to actually replicate that and do it at pace and at scale. And one of the things that I've often reflected on in terms of how do we drive this forward? How do we, you know, because it has to, we all hear it has to start from the top. And I know there is a commitment in lots of organisations, but a question that I think, you know, we could perhaps ask ourselves to try to speed up the pace of change and not necessarily wait for that external intervention is, you know, if our funding as a sector relied on us being able to demonstrate what we were doing in order to, you know, tackle racism, to be anti-racist organisations, to increase that diversity at senior levels within our organisations. If our funding depended on that, what would we do differently?
It's a really powerful question there.
Yeah, I think it's a really powerful question. And it's one that I think it's good to reflect on, because there's always that thing about when it you boil it down to money and it's hitting, you know, pockets, could decisions be a bit different? So definitely something to dwell on. But totally agree that I think we're at the point where we need probably external intervention. Sandra, thank you so much. Very much like Leah, I was scribbling away, and I think it touched a bit on some of the challenges that you may have faced. But I just wanted to ask this direct question that came in prior, which said, as a Black woman leader, have you faced unique challenges within the sector, and how have you personally overcome them?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if they are unique. I think other Black female leaders will probably be facing or have faced some of the challenges that I've had. I think the big one that stands out for me is probably having to justify my place at the table. I think that's the biggest one, and you feel it often. I feel it often when I walk into situations where, especially new situations, where someone perhaps hasn't met me before, and, you know, you might have the title, and for some people who perhaps don't look like me, the title is enough. But actually, if you know, sometimes if you walk into the room as a Black woman with that title, you have to prove that you have earned that place at the table in terms of this, the expectation that you will be able to talk in a way that demonstrates your knowledge, your experience, your grasp of the issue. I often see the light bulb come on. You see it, but it's just one of those things where you feel, why is it necessary? We're here to address a particular issue or to deal with a particular matter. Why do I need to spend the first few minutes of this meeting trying to convince you that I do know what I'm talking about? My response to that has been to just make sure that I do know what I'm talking about. I will not go into anything unprepared. I won't go into a meeting without having made sure that I've read everything. I've anticipated the questions that might come through. I can't just rock up and just expect to be able to engage in a particular issue without, so it's always that feeling that I have to be over prepared.
Yeah.
And but that's how I've dealt with it. It hasn't got better. That's one of the areas that I feel has not got better despite the years of experience. So I think that is something that's inherent with who I am as a Black woman, rather than my lack of experience or that's I think I'd say is the biggest challenge. Always constantly having to prove yourself.
Wow, that's really interesting. I know Vio's got some questions that he has typed up. But before we go to those, Sam, thanks for your question. It says, great to hear about your journey. Just wanted to know if you had any mentors or supporters along the way to help act as a sounding board.
Yeah, great question. I have had lots of supporters along the way, and mentors, coaches, formal and informal, and it's made a great difference. It's something I would certainly recommend. At the moment, I have a really good network of people who are always checking in, which I really value, and who I know that I can always pick up the phone to as well, which, and I think you need that, and you definitely need that as a senior leader in the sector. But with some of the challenges that we're currently facing, it's really invaluable. But it's actually something that has kept me in the sector, to be honest, because there have been many times where I've thought, is it really worth it? Should I try something else? As I know that many others have. I have seen some real talent being lost to the sector, sadly, because people have felt that they've not been able to navigate. So for me, having mentors has made a huge difference. Just being able to pick up the phone and say, I have this challenge. This is what I'm doing. Do you think it's the right thing? Any other ideas? Have I missed something? That is invaluable. And when I was at Peabody, and since then, I've also had formal coaches as well. I've been involved in leadership development programs as well. I think there's investing in yourself. None of us are experts. None of us know everything. We can't. That's why we have teams there that actually, you bring the right people to work with you. But as you progress within an organisation, my experience has been the demands and the challenges on you change. And so it's really important to be able to check in with someone who has a different perspective, who can help you to maybe reflect on things that haven't gone so well, and what the learning is that you take from that. So if ever there is an opportunity to have a mentor or a coach, to build that network, I would certainly encourage that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Sandra. And I love that, because I love the idea, again, of community and just harnessing collective genius, as I like to call it. I have a question around the many roles and hats that women wear. And you mentioned during your presentation about working as a working mother, working with place shapers, as well as your role. And my question really is, women do often wear many hats. How do you find that balance between the different roles in your life?
Yes, well, we do wear many hats, and often women ask me, can we have it all? And I'll tend to say yes, but not all at the same time, because it is so difficult spinning these plates. That's the reality of it. There's something always has to give, has been my experience. And I think that's where the guilt kicks in, where you think, oh my gosh, I've spent so much time at work, I've perhaps not done as much with the kids as I've needed to do. But for me, it's about just keeping that sense of perspective, because the universe is bigger than any one of us, and the world will keep spinning, whether you've done a particular thing or not. So it's keeping the sense of perspective, trying not to be too hard on yourself, but also knowing when to take time out. And for me, there'll be things. I know I love travel, so for me that is the thing that really allows me to kind of recharge batteries, come back focused, etc. But I do try not to be too hard on myself. The big thing for me is just making sure I don't work 24 hours a day, I suppose, and just making sure that there are boundaries. Again, as well as perspective, I think boundaries are really important. But I would say that at any one time, there's a limit to what you can do, and don't burn yourself out, because there is a perception about what a successful woman should be doing. I try to say everything in its time, and I like to think that I don't just measure my own success by my success in the workplace or by my career. There are other elements of my life that are as important. So, yeah, so it's that sense of perspective.
Yeah.
Thank you
Well,
so
thank
much.
you.
Yeah, the questions are coming in thick and fast. Chinyere, I hope that has somewhat answered your own question that you put through. Rose, we note your comments about having to justify. We know Sandra is doing a fantastic job. Before I go to Sam's question, actually, I'd like Yogita's question, which says, what has been your biggest inspiration, Sandra? What or who, I guess.
Yeah, this goes back quite far for me, really, because I don't think there's any one person that has been the biggest inspiration. I can, if I look at my parents and what they've achieved and what they sacrificed, to come to the UK and to stay, because as I said, they did not come to stay, and I look at that is an inspiration to me. I remember growing up in the 80s and thinking, okay, yeah, we've got the odd role model, that you can see, the Moira Stewarts of this world, the Trevor McDonalds, etc. But also being really mindful of what was happening in America at the time. And, those of you who are old enough to remember, I would always go out and buy this magazine called Ebony magazine. And what I liked about that was that they always ran these sections that showed you how people from quite modest backgrounds were able to benefit through positive action, or affirmative action as they called it then, and education, etc. And I remember reading some of those articles and thinking, well, why can't I benefit from something like that, or why can't that be me, in 10 whatever years? So just reading other people's stories for me was that big inspiration. And then just being around, I've worked with amazing people, and just being around them and seeing how others have progressed in their careers, that is an inspiration to me. And just to see the impact that others have had in the sector, so it's not any one person. If I had to single someone out, again, it would be someone who was really in the public eye, very much in the kind of 80s and 90s, who's Mae Jemison, the astronaut and engineer and doctor and dancer and all these other things. And she stands out for me because she doesn't allow herself to be pigeonholed. She does all of these things. And this quote from her, which I won't be able to quote word for word, but the sentiment is, don't let other people limit what you want to do in your life, but also don't limit others. That is a real inspiration for me.
I love that quote, and it's definitely something to aspire by. And actually, I think it leads in very nicely. Someone's shared a question in the chat about people giving up along the way. And the question is, do you think this is the untold story, the exhaustion of having to prove yourself sometimes on a daily basis?
Yeah, I do think it is the untold story. I am hearing more people talk about it. We need to acknowledge it before people leave. We need to acknowledge the exhaustion that comes with having to constantly prove yourself, with the undermining that comes from the various kind of microaggressions that, that are about undermining, having people question your commitment, not recognizing your contribution. Those are the kind of behaviors where you inevitably start to question, is it the right place for me? And in my mind, any organization that has that commitment to building that engaging, inclusive, anti-racist culture will be asking those questions that could potentially prevent people from just giving up along the way, or not necessarily giving up, or taking their energy, their talent, their enthusiasm, commitment somewhere else and making a success of it, somewhere where it's going to be valued. So perhaps it is the unspoken, untold story, but there is an opportunity to acknowledge it and start to engage with it and understand what we can do differently to tackle those things.
Perfect. And we've got one more question. Please do feel free to pop those in the chat as we're discussing, as they kind of come to you. So one more question from Sam. If you could do it all again, Sandra, is there anything you would change?
Wow. Overall, I would say that I have had a really incredibly rewarding, fulfilling, enjoyable career. So I would still choose housing if I was doing it again. If I was making the decision now, though, in terms of what the sector is like now, I probably would not choose housing. And I do worry about how we continue to attract and retain the best people in the climate that we currently work within. And I'm talking about the broader environment, and all the challenges, all the sector challenges that we have, and so I'm not sure that I would choose housing now, but I don't regret the choice. I am coming towards the end of my career. I don't regret the choice. There are probably things that I would have perhaps done differently along the way. There's nothing that really does stand out, though, because I've enjoyed all of my roles. I really have. The one thing that I probably haven't been able to do as much of, but again, there's still time for this, is the paying back. Yes, I've mentored people along the way, but perhaps not as much as I could. And I've joined the 25. I think that is really an opportunity to make sure that, as we think about what do we need to do over the next 5, 10, 15 years, that I'm actually contributing to that based on my experience. But no, I don't think. For me, every experience is a kind of blessing, and you learn from it. And I'm a great reflector, and I tend to. I've often said, I remember one of my mentors said to me, what drives you? And I've said, I just want to live a life with no regrets. And so I don't regret things that I've done, but if they haven't quite gone as I'd hoped, I'll try and learn from it and move on and not beat myself up about it. Yeah, there are things that I could have done better, but I'll try not to repeat it.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sandra. I know you touch on paying back. I think you probably don't know the impact just you being there has had on so many people in the sector. So while you may not have engaged one-on-one, just your story and your career has inspired lots of people. And I'm just thinking about what you said about, would I have joined housing? What are the 3 top things you would encourage someone who is starting their career in housing or wanting to progress? What are the top 3 things you'd encourage them to maybe reflect on or do? I think you touched on it in your story, but just 3 top things they should do to either when they join housing or wanting to progress within housing.
Yeah, I've said a few things along the way, but one thing I haven't mentioned is resilience, and just really protecting your own health and well-being. And kind of knowing when to take a break, to move on, to unwind, all of those things I feel, kind of help you in building your resilience. So, the having the network there, the people who are you can lean on, who you'll support, they'll support you. That would be one area that I would really emphasize. Again, just to repeat the point about taking some calculated risks, it's easy to just sit in your comfort zone. But think about where you're heading and what risks you are prepared to take. Understand what they are, have a plan to manage them. Don't be reckless. That's not what I'm suggesting here. But, be prepared to take some calculated risks if you want your career to move on. And it's not always the best job, but make it the best job. It's a bit like housing, isn't it? You kind of buy the worst house on the best street. Sometimes you have to take a job that isn't necessarily the best, but you can turn it into something fantastic. So that would be the second point. And then the other would be about building that team, surround yourself with people that you can trust. That would be my final point.
Thank you, Sandra. And I'm going to pick on that word you used there, which is trust. And the question is really around psychological safety for women in our workspaces. There is the reality, unfortunately, that a lot of women don't feel physically safe. And this is just in society in general. Do you have any thoughts on how we can create psychological safety in our workplaces?
Yeah, gosh, you've really kept some really big, challenging questions for me, because again, that's another biggie, which is just it's linked back to what we were talking about earlier around culture of the organization. And, for me, psychological safety is about feeling safe enough to take risks, to air your views, that you feel seen, you feel acknowledged, etc. I've used examples of where that hasn't always been the case for me, but it's trying to create that culture where your voices are heard, people feel recognized, all the things that organizations try to do if they want to be a good employer. They'll be doing those things anyway, won't they? And so it's doing that mindful of the experience of your people, your colleagues, your staff, your employees, however you describe them, and getting their perspective on what it looks and feels like when I feel safe enough to say something, to voice my concerns. I mean, I personally, being the kind of person who just says it, I mean, I will think about what I say and how it may land and how it might come across. But if I see something I'm not comfortable with, I will say it, because I'm very values driven, and I think integrity is everything to me. But not everyone will feel that they're in a position to take the risk that often comes with that. So for me, it's around looking at your organization's culture, and really seeing if it's a place where people just feel they have to keep their head down to stay safe. They're not airing their opinions, etc. Some of the things that I've seen work well to help with this whole thing around psychological safety are some of the staff networks that I know you have within Octavia, where there is within Peabody, where is that safe place to air concerns and to discuss quite openly about how it feels. That is effective if those messages are going somewhere else and being acted upon, really. So I think every organization needs to come up with its own approach. But there are some good examples in terms of some things that are happening within Peabody, within Octavia as well. We have our own Black staff network as well. But it's what are those conditions that need to be in place for the culture to be one where people feel safe to air their concerns, or that's as much as I can say on that one. It is such a complex. I mean, organizational culture is complex, isn't it? And this is part of that.
Yeah, it definitely is. So I won't add to the question and ask you what we still need to do to eradicate racism, in organizations, because I think you've touched a bit on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, I'll go back to that big question, really, in terms of what would we do differently? And if our lives depended on it, if our funding depended on it, if our livelihoods, what would we be doing differently? But I do think there is probably a role for not just plans, but targets. So that it's not just what you're going to do, but it's the impact that you're hoping to achieve through that. I'm by no means an expert. I do what I feel, and what I'm hearing in my own organisation. As I said, we are working in really, really challenging times. There are so many demands on us as leaders within the sector, and I can see why sometimes the focus has to move. But we are socially, we are there with a social purpose within the housing sector, and part of that is serving our communities. We are in diverse communities, and so we have to look at what that means in terms of, our organisations. So I've said my bit in terms of just considering that scenario where the world was very different, and we wouldn't get that funding without being able to demonstrate this. And I think that is an interesting challenge. But I would also say there are experts out there who can help us on this journey. I've read and reread and, still keep dipping into Shireen Daniels' book around, the anti-racist organisation. I think there are some really, really helpful ideas, and, they really challenge us to think in a very, very different way. So, yeah, that would be my plug. Go and have a read. I don't, I'm not going to receive any royalties from people buying her book, but I do feel that it's a good place to start.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Sandra. And we have just gone, I can't believe that the hour is almost over and we've touched on so many different topics. So in order to start wrapping it up, I think I'm going to come back to a question that is for you. So how do you hope that the work that you have done will leave a lasting impact on the housing sector and also inspire future generations of Black women leaders?
IJ. Your point about, perhaps I underestimate, or we underestimate, the impact of just having someone in our positions and showing what's possible. I do hope that people coming through the sector will take some inspiration from that. Yes, it's not an easy journey, but it's possible. And I am by no means the only example. There are many others, many other Black women now who are CEOs. And so, take something from that journey about what's possible, and, connect with us. I'm always happy to have a conversation. Time is always the enemy, but yes, that's definitely one thing. So in terms of, I think it's being true to your values, true to who you are, if I'm answering your question. Try not to reinvent and be someone else. You can be who you are, you can bring those values, to the workplace, and just really make sure that the things that are important to you have your focus. And so for me, I have chosen to work for those organisations that not just aspire to provide good housing, but to do more in their communities. And I'd like to think that part of the legacy are the thousands of asylum seekers and refugees that we've been able to help on their way, whether they were given right to remain or not, but give them a safe sanctuary whilst they go through this challenging time. That actually, that I've prevented, or, the organisations I've worked for have meant, their work has meant that people have not ended up in bed and breakfast accommodation that they otherwise would have, which means that their children can achieve more, that they can have family life, that, that they can really live a normal life, or as normal as possible in a really difficult time. But just generally, that actually what we do as a sector makes a huge difference. We don't always get it right. It hurts me personally whenever I see any individual complaint come in, that, again, we've not quite done what we aspire to do. But actually, at the end of the day, most of us are driven by wanting to make a difference and have a real impact. And I think that's the legacy. If we just do the best that we can to achieve those things, to house more people, then yeah, that's all I hope for personally.
Not a lot at all, Sandra, and I'm sure all that will be achieved. But just to, to close the session, I really want to express my gratitude to you, Sandra, for your valuable time. An hour out of a CEO's diary is not easy to get, so thank you so much. And also my appreciation to each and everyone who participated in this session. We have more events planned for Black History Month in Peabody, so if you haven't already, please register. But wishing everyone a really wonderful rest of the afternoon. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.